Brahma Chalukadhipati Sahampati Katanjali Anadivaram Maya Jata Santita Sata Parajaka Jatika Dese tu Dhammam Anukampimam Pajam.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namassāmi. So, the last 3 sessions, we've been talking about the first 3 noble truths. To emphasize or bring into awareness is how these 4 noble truths are really 4 aspects of one same thing. So when the Buddha points out the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, discontent or suffering, and inviting us to take a look at it, we're letting it into experience, acknowledging its presence, but also allowing ourselves to actually feel the discontent, recognize it, and study it. When we open our hearts, open to noticing discontent, noticing dissatisfaction, suffering, we notice there's a natural reaction to not want it that we have to acknowledge as well. But then if we take an interest in the phenomenon, if we had to actually ask ourselves what this discontent is, what does it feel like? Where does it come from? We're inevitably going to start looking at the second noble truth, where it comes from, as it arises as a consequence from grasping desire. And as we watch discontent, how it operates, we inevitably notice that it's impermanent. And come in contact with a third noble truth, the fact that discontent, suffering ceases. While we're doing all of this, the way we are paying attention, the way we're looking at our experience, how we're investigating it, that's all part of the fourth noble truth. Mindfulness. We bring our awareness to what we're looking at, discontent, investigating it, studying it. We have to pay attention and then be with it. Have a sense of being with it here and now as it is. That's part of samadhi. What we call concentration, and the Latin etymology of concentration is really being with the center. So we come back to the center, look at our experience as it arises here and now. We're investigating, making an effort to understand this, understand how suffering arises, what it is, how it ceases. It's establishing right view. So all four aspects, all four noble truths really come together as one thing. It's not four different things that we have to go and look for in four different corners of the room or the world or anything like that. They're really all part and parcel of one same thing. It is extremely useful that the Buddha pointed out these four different noble truths because it allows us to really investigate this experience of discontent, of suffering, and it helps us understand it. When detectives or investigators are investigating a crime, they have a protocol they need to follow as well, go through different steps, but they're really all looking at one single event and trying to understand what happened. The protocols and the steps that they go through are something that help them approach the situation, help them assess it from different perspectives, look at it under different angles, but they're really just studying one event. And this is what we're doing with these Four Noble Truths. We're really bringing attention to discontent, to suffering as we experience it in daily life, and then learning to investigate it, look at it. And this is helping to bring us to a position of investigating discontent and suffering that's allowing us to recognize it for what it is, rather than relating to it the way we usually do, which is the way we want things to be. So that's what we call right view. So notice how the Buddha says there is suffering. He doesn't say, I am suffering. There is suffering. It has an origin. It ceases. And there's a way to realize this cessation, to know it, to really know it for yourself. That's what realization is. So this stating the Four Noble Truths as the Buddha did is really something that brings us right back to a point of view, a way of looking at our experience. It really is a point of view that is in accordance with things the way they are, in accordance with Dhamma. And in contrast, it is helping us let go of this other point of view that we're accustomed to, which is a point of view of self, which is what we call wrong view in Dhamma terminology. Right and wrong view being what results in the end of suffering in case of right view. What we call a wrong view is what results in more suffering. So this aspect of right view is a very, very important one in cultivating the path, in developing the practice, and our attempts to understand this experience of life, this experience of happiness and suffering, trying to make sense of it, because that's what we're all doing one way or another, and using the Buddha's guidance to guide this process, this attempt to understand, these efforts at investigating our experience. If we come back to his teaching of the Four Noble Truths, it will always help us come back to this point of view, which is what we call a right view. And that is helping us to look at things in terms of what they are, as they are in the moment. At the beginning, this really takes a little bit of mental exercise. Well, I say at the beginning, actually, not only at the beginning, it really is. The Buddha speaks about wisdom in three different levels or categories of wisdom. There's the intellectual wisdom or the theoretical understanding of the teaching, theoretical understanding of Dhamma. And that's operating on the level of thinking. When we listen to a Dhamma talk, when we read a Dhamma book, it's conveyed with words and with thoughts, and it explains Dhamma, it explains the teaching in a certain way. And then there's a second level of wisdom, of understanding, which is once we've acquainted ourselves and familiarized ourselves with a certain amount of theoretical Dhamma, which is basically these teachings of the Buddha, where he's trying to point out suffering, its origin, its impermanence, and how to know this for ourselves. He's basically giving us a map, a frame of reference through which we can then look at our experience. So that's the second level of wisdom, is really having familiarized ourselves with some of these instructions, these teachings, then asking ourselves, well, how does that apply in my experience? How does that apply to daily life? So we're using thinking in a certain way to guide the way we're looking at it. We're looking at ourselves, looking at our relationship to the body, looking at our relationship with our moods, our emotions, our sense of who we are, what we are. And then the third level of wisdom is once we've used this kind of intellectual understanding and start comparing it with what's here, we start becoming more familiar with this different point of view. Excuse me. In the process, we inevitably notice what our habitual point of view is in terms of self, and what the result is in our lives and our experiences of relating to things in terms of self. And then every time we recognize that, leave it alone, and then come back to a point of view where we're looking at things in terms of Dhamma, not in terms of self, not in terms of what we want or don't want, but in terms of what is. As we become more familiar with this point of view, we learn how to come back to that and look at experience in those terms, in terms of Dhamma. And then we can let go of the words. The words guide us. The theoretical teachings gently guide us to this point. And then when we're there, and the mind goes quiet, and we're really watching from this point of view, that it's just a point of view of awareness, not of self. We're not creating a sense of self out of things. We're just present to the moment as it is, the body, the mind. And just witnessing it in silence, in the silence of the mind. And directly witnessing arising and ceasing. And that's knowing beyond words. It's like when we're kids, we all put our hand on a candle flame or on the hot plate in the kitchen and burned ourselves. We can describe the sensations as being hot, burning. We can describe words to explain it, but the actual experience of heat and pain, we don't need any words for that. We know what it is. So that's the difference. A similar difference in these three levels of wisdom. There's the intellectual understanding of Dhamma. Then there's practicing it and bringing it into the heart, really comparing this map this lay of the land according to this map, and then according to our usual way of looking at things and comparing them. And then as we learn to follow this and recognize where it brings us, how contemplating things in terms of Dhamma always brings us back to this place of awareness, simple awareness of things the way they are, not in terms of self. And when we are there and we learn to settle there and trust this place of refuge as a place from which we can experience the present moment without creating suffering, adding suffering to it, and that's where we get to know, really register what arising, change, and cessation is like. And the knowledge that arises from being here, noticing arising and ceasing, staying with it, and then when something has ceased, still being here with awareness and knowing awareness once a sankhara has passed. That knowledge is not something you can convey with words, but you know. And so those are the three levels of understanding, of wisdom that we develop. So this aspect of what we call right view is a very important one, because as Ajahn Chah used to explain in developing the Noble Eightfold Path, it's like we're walking down this path, and when ignorance is the tone of our experience, if ignorance is what we're moving around in, then we're basically moving around in the darkness, trying to follow a path. And what we need is a good flashlight that we can shine on the path, and then we can follow that path. That's what right view is, it's that flashlight. So it's very important to work. It does require an effort to develop right view. And it starts with developing a theoretical understanding, what the Buddha taught. What are the Four Noble Truths? How does he advise investigating them? What are they? Some people like to just keep it simple and learn just a few basics, but there are a few basics we need to learn. It's really like picking up a tool. We actually need to bend over and pick it up. So don't be afraid of doing a little bit of study. When you listen to a Dhamma talk or when you're reading a Dhamma book, take a few notes and really summarize it and sort of help it crystallize in your memory so you know what it is. And then later you can refer to this. After we've listened to a talk, after we've read a book, get on with our lives. Inevitably, we run into suffering, we run into discontent. And that's the moment we can stop inside and go, okay, so how do these teachings apply to this right now? It's very important to do this. It does not take much time. It's a little bit of homework, so to say. But it really, really pays off. Because then when we're trying to bring together the different aspects of this path to practice in a well-rounded way, then we can look at what these three aspects of the path are: wisdom, morality, and concentration. So those are the three groups under which the 8 factors of the path are summarized. So the aspect of wisdom is right view and the right attitude, right intention. What we call the section of morality is right speech, right action, right livelihood. And what we call the section of concentration is right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So if we are interested in understanding suffering, understanding what the hell is happening to us when we're unhappy, We want to figure that one out. We want to try to become free from it. How do we go about it? Well, first thing, come back to right view. What is right view? What is wrong view? And just keeping it very simple. Right view is looking at things in terms of Dhamma, of what they are. Wrong view is looking at things in terms of self. Right view is understanding that it's inevitable that we will experience discontent, that it arises from one form of desire or another that we have grasped hold of. The wrong view would be trying to get away from the suffering, grasping more desire to experience happiness, to replace the suffering or discontent, or desire to get rid of the suffering. And if we grasp it, then we're just reacting to it blindly. So understanding the difference between right view and wrong view will help us in how we respond, how we position ourselves in relationship to whatever discontent or suffering we're experiencing. The section on morality, right speech, right action, right livelihood, are some pretty basic principles of behavioral hygiene, so to say. If we want to reduce the amount of suffering we encounter in life, it is very helpful to be careful with our speech and with our actions. So this is where we come across the 5 precepts in their most morality in this most basic form. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if we don't kill people, we don't run into trouble. If we're not stealing other people's belongings, we also avoid a certain amount of trouble. Or consider if you do feel a murderous rage and want to kill somebody, just stop for a moment and think of the consequences, and it's very easy to see the difference between the suffering that will arise if we follow that course of action. If we kill, steal, behave in a very loose way in relationship to sexuality, if we just let our mouths run and indulge in all manners of drugs and alcohol, what are the results of that kind of behavior? And then if we abstain from those things, what is our life likely to look like? And it's quite easy to see that we really shed a lot of complications and avoid a lot of difficulties if we just keep to these 5 principles, avoiding taking life, taking what is not given, behaving in relationship to sexuality, which is creating suffering for ourselves and others, speaking untruthfully or having coarse speech or malicious speech, indulging in some nasty little gossip, or just talking pointlessly all the time. And then drinking alcohol and taking drugs. So in terms of coming back to our attempt to understand what this life is about, happiness and suffering, how does it all work? If we are interested in following the Buddha's guidance and looking at discontent, looking at suffering and trying to understand it, it is really helpful to establish a peaceful relationship with our environment, with other people, and with ourselves. That's what right speech, right livelihood, right action, right livelihood do for us. There's some very simple housekeeping rules, so to say. Now, the way we relate to those precepts, these ways of being careful of our actions, of our speech, how we earn a living. As we become more sensitive, as we become more interested and introspective, investigative of our life and how living our lives affects our experience of happiness and suffering, then we understand how to refine our relationship to these precepts, to these principles of what we call morality. Because really what it is establishing a way of relating, for us to relate to other people, to relate to the world, that causes a minimum amount of suffering in those interactions. And the more we investigate that, the more refined our adjustments can be. To give you an example of how it can go from some pretty simple things to more refined, there's a monk I've heard of who was living in the south of Thailand, where a lot of the people around there were putting food in his alms bowl, who came to the monasteries were living from fishing. And out on the sea, in the south of Thailand, things are not always very safe. And some people make a livelihood from fishing. And there's also a bunch of piracy going on. So a lot of kidnapping, stealing, killing, all kinds of things going on there. And this monk was a very kind of realistic monk. And when he was trying to teach some Dhamma, teach some simple principles of Dhamma to these people, he didn't teach them to keep 5 precepts because he knew some of them were incapable of doing that. But what he tried to teach them is to at least not kill people. He knew they were not necessarily able to stop being pirates just one day to the other, but at least he could teach them not to be killing other living beings, which was a big step. So starting with whatever we're able to do, and then learning how to appreciate the effect it has on the quality of our lives, and then wondering if we can take it further. If this little has this kind of pleasant result, if I put in a little more, give up a little more, maybe that makes my life easier, and there's even less suffering arising in my life, in the life of others around me. So we learn to refine the standard of speech and action and livelihood that we're observing. And then as we're investigating discontent, as we're investigating suffering, you probably notice that for most of us, when we come in contact with the Dhamma, and we hear it for the first time, it kind of also sounds wonderful and great, and we think, oh, this is fantastic stuff, and we're all encouraged and have faith that this is a good teaching. In theory, at least, it does sound like it leads to less suffering. And then we get on with life after having heard a Dhamma talk and maybe done a little spot of meditation. We run into the next thing that pushes our buttons and we fly off the handle again. We go through periods of our lives where we think Buddhism and the Buddha's teachings are really fantastic, are really good stuff, but generally we feel happy in life, and not too many problems, and we live our lives getting distracted by all kinds of things. And it's only when we run into another patch of suffering that we actually stop and say, so what was that stuff again? And we sit down and we want to meditate because life is really tough, suffering, and I need to figure this thing out. And we do a spot of meditation, we listen to a Dhamma talk or read something. And then the suffering ceases because that's what it does. Life seems hunky-dory again, and off we go. And we go through these cycles of contemplating Dhamma and practicing meditation when we suffer. But when we don't suffer, we just get on with life and tend to forget about it. So in the process of developing this understanding of life, we get to watch this kind of heedlessness that arises when we feel happy enough, and the sense of urgency that arises when we actually run into suffering. And we can ask ourselves quite legitimately, how can we bring this teachings, this practice into our lives that kind of permeates the whole of our lives more, rather than something that is part of our lives intermittently? Does it actually work to practice meditation, listen to Dhamma only when we're suffering, and then as soon as the suffering is over, we just go back to our usual way of relating to life? We can do that, but then watch what happens. Being interested in what happens at that level is also practice, is also Dhamma. And asking ourselves, well, if this is the way I go about it, how successful is it in helping me avoid suffering or allowing suffering to cease when it has arisen? And we realize, if we watch things and we're really looking at what's happening, we realize this, it works some, but it's not very effective. Because we're only picking up this tool and investigating and looking inside when we experience suffering. And if we actually do look at what happens when suffering arises, if we're actually really watching, we realize that part of the cause of us always running into suffering is this heedlessness that arises, that we kind of let go of everything and just enjoy life, enjoy distractions, enjoy whatever activities we go into. And we're not actually paying attention to what it is that happens during these periods of happy heedlessness that may be setting the stage for the suffering that arises after a while. So what is it that is happening there? And this is a really important aspect of the path, is having this interest, investigating. It's called Dhamma Vichaya, investigation of Dhamma. And it's not necessarily just a kind of intellectual pursuit of the Buddha's teaching. It's using the Buddha's teaching to guide our understanding of our lives, understanding suffering. How does it arise? Why does it arise? Are our habits of blaming others, blaming conditions, blaming situations, are those habits helpful? Do they actually help us understand suffering? Do they help us let go of suffering? Do they help us comprehend and really know what is happening when suffering arises, changes, and ceases? Or is looking inside? There may be conditions outside of us that contribute to suffering arising. The people we like to blame, the situations and conditions we like to find fault with, saying, if it was otherwise, I would be happy. If he or she didn't say or do this and that, I'd be better off. If they could behave differently, I wouldn't be suffering. There may be some truth to that. But what about what's happening here? What about how we approach a situation, how we view it, how we react to it? What part does that play in this suffering that's arising? So just in the general approach that we have to understanding happiness and suffering and how does it all work, the interests we have in understanding suffering, knowing the end, the cessation of suffering, investigating its origin, all that interest, all that curiosity. And that's all part of this factor of right effort that we find in the Noble Eightfold Path. Right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. They work together. The Buddha has a very, very beautiful way of talking about right effort. I mean, he talks about it in different ways, but there's one kind of standard way he describes right effort. It has these four aspects. Two of them relate to wholesome states and two of them relate to unwholesome states. And for each of them, there's states that have arisen or have not yet arisen. So that's kind of the basic structure. So right effort in that kind of structure is about abandoning unwholesome states that have arisen and trying to avoid unwholesome states that have not yet arisen. And then the same combination for wholesome states, trying to give rise to wholesome states that haven't yet arisen and nurturing, developing the wholesome states that have already arisen. But there's a very interesting part of the Buddha's description of right efforts that precedes each of these four aspects. And the Buddha says one generates desire, endeavors, puts forth effort, one strives for the sake of abandoning unwholesome states that have arisen, avoiding unwholesome states that haven't yet, etc. It starts with generating desire. And that's basically an aspiration. So we can be in the thick of suffering, we can be experiencing some very unpleasant, negative mental states. We can feel lost, we can be full of doubt. Whatever it is, the moment in our hearts this thing arises about how can I see through this? How can I figure this out? How can I, even if we think of it in terms of self, how can I get rid of anger? Which is a very classic way of relating to anger in terms of self. But even that question, how do I get rid of anger? That itself is already right effort, because it is generating the desire to let go of an unwholesome state of mind. It's good to recognize this wish for goodness, to recognize this aspiration to be free from suffering, whatever way it manifests. Because that's basically right effort. It's seeking the end of suffering, and we can trust that. We can nourish it. And if we nourish it, then we go from, in this beautiful sequence that Buddha talks about, from generating desire, and then endeavor. We endeavor. It's really kind of generating the desire is really kind of bringing that up. And then endeavor, we're really starting to lean forward, putting forth effort, kind of pushing against it, striving, really working there. And then it's a very progressive sense of effort, starting with just something as simple as generating desire. As we're doing this, establishing, coming back to right view, very important in the practice, always come back to right view so we understand which direction we're going. Right view will guide the efforts we make. Without right view, we can make a lot of effort and it'll be misguided, and it's often results in more frustration, discontent, and suffering. So it's very important to come back to right view, which will direct our efforts and which will also direct us to coming to look at our experience in terms of Dhamma. It teaches us The Buddha is basically teaching us how to look at experience in terms of what it is, rather than in terms of what I would like it to be, in terms of I and wanting. And there's another aspect of the Four Noble Truths of the Noble Eightfold Path here that is worth studying, and that is the four foundations of mindfulness. There's only four of them. So I'm sometimes surprised. I ask people what those are, and people who've been Buddhists for quite some time, and maybe they can tell me one or two of them, but they're not quite sure. And then if I asked any further explanations on them, they're completely clueless. It makes me feel a bit sad because it's such a simple structure. It's not difficult to memorize, and it is really, really helpful in learning to guide our efforts and guide us in the practice. So I really encourage you to pick up any book and just write out a brief summary of what these are. So for the purpose of the discussion here, the four foundations of mindfulness: the body, feelings, the mind, states of mind, and what the Buddha calls mind objects, are four categories. There are four ways of looking at anything we experience that is safe. It is in terms of what it is, not in terms of me and mine and what I want it to be. So the Buddha uses a very beautiful simile where he compares the four foundations of mindfulness to a safe place where we are safe from suffering and from delusion. In the same way, a cow herder herds his cows and puts them to graze in four pastures that are fenced off, that are safe, where they are safe from predators such as wolves. If the cows leave the pastures and go wandering around, then the wolves can get them. As long as the cow herder keeps them within the confines of these four pastures, they are safe. And it's a very beautiful simile, because when you start using these teachings to guide the efforts in the practice, where we're going, what we're doing. So we experience a situation, we're suffering, and we realize that it arises from relating to the suffering, to the conditions in terms of I, me, what I want, what I like, what I don't like. And we step out of that, just leave it alone for a while, and we say, all of this, what would it be in terms of Dhamma, in terms of the Buddha's teaching? All these teachings are very, very useful in helping us leave that point of view of I and mine, which inevitably results in suffering, and coming back to what is it, but in terms of Dhamma. And here we come back to the four foundations of mindfulness. This body, when we learn to look at it in terms of a body that is breathing, that goes through life using four postures: standing, walking, sitting, and lying down, that's made of food, that we only see the skin of, the wrapping, the envelope, but is actually filled with other stuff that we don't usually pay attention to and that are not very attractive, certainly not as presentable as the envelope of the skin. When we look at the body in terms of my body, then when anything happens to it, we worry and we suffer. We're afraid of sickness, we're afraid of COVID, we're afraid of cancer, we're afraid of all kinds of diseases. We're afraid of death, because this is my body and I'm attached to it and I like it the way it is and I don't want it to be otherwise. I don't want to experience pain. I only want to experience pleasant sights, sounds, smells, tastes, sensations in the body. So when we're relating to this body in terms of me and mine and what I want and don't want, what I like and don't like, we experience a lot of suffering and worry and fear and anxiety. When we agree to look at it in terms of this different perspective that the Buddha is giving us, it is a body. Bodies are born. Bodies change, they get old, they get sick, and they die. Bodies walk, bodies sit, bodies stand, bodies lie down, they get tired, they need food, they need to be washed, they need to be taken to the bathroom. It's a different way of looking at the body. Instead of looking at it as my possession, my belonging, and I want it to be exactly the way I like it, it's still the same body, but we're learning to look at it for what it is. What is the nature of the body? We can look at this body, we can look at other bodies, they all have the same nature. They all follow the same course. They're born, they grow, they get old, sick, and then eventually they die. That's the nature of a body. When you're driving down the road and you see roadkill, that's what happens to bodies. When you go to the supermarket and you see a lot of meat on the shelves, that's what happens to bodies. They're made of food and they are food. When bodies die, they become food for other creatures. If we bury a body, the worms get to it. In our societies, we tend to cremate the bodies. But even before we cremate the bodies, when the body has died and it's waiting for creation, bacteria are eating it up from the inside. So there are ways of contemplating the body that help us acknowledge what the nature of a body is, what it's made of, what naturally happens to a body. And the more we come to contemplate that and accept that the reality of these bodies is like this, the less we will create suffering around wanting it to be otherwise, because we're accepting the truth of it, the reality of it. And we can do the same with the other three foundations of mindfulness. We're talking about feelings. What are feelings of happiness and pain, pleasure and displeasure, or neutral feelings? Investigate what is your experience when you relate to these feelings in terms of me, I am happy, I am unhappy. Or when we just look at it as, oh, this is a pleasant feeling, oh, this is an unpleasant feeling. The difference there is between relating to it in terms of self and in terms of Dhamma. Studying the mind. The Buddha talks about the mind in the four foundations of mindfulness in terms of states that arise, are present or are absent. That's very interesting as well. There is the mind that is overcome with anger, or there's the mind that is free from anger. The mind that's under the influence of lust, greed, or the mind that is free from lust or greed. The mind that is overcome with delusion, confusion, or free from it. Concentrated mind or the unconcentrated mind. So usually we relate to these things. I just take the first one, anger. We relate to that usually as I am angry. And if we grasp it and believe it, become self-righteous. And that usually results in someone else's suffering first, and then after it's passed, in our suffering because we regret it. Or we don't want the anger. I'm a Buddhist, I shouldn't be angry, I shouldn't be experiencing this. How do we get rid of it? And both of those are relating to anger in terms of self. Bhavatanha, becoming angry, I am angry, or vibhavatanha, wanting to get rid of it, wanting to be someone who's free from anger. but is still someone, is still relating to it in terms of self. But the Buddha is suggesting different perspective. This is anger. Anger is like this. Right now it's present, and then it ceases, and then right now it's absent. This is what anger is like. It arises and it ceases, and it's not self. And then in the section of Dhammas, the Buddha is bringing into awareness ways of relating to our experiences in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Learning to relate to experience in terms of the five aggregates, in terms of the 7 factors of enlightenment, how to develop these, how they are conducive to freedom from suffering. So really investigate and study these foundations of mindfulness and really appreciate how they really give you a position from which to experience, to investigate, and to position ourselves in a relationship to experience that is not self. There is a certain amount of suffering that comes with having a body and a mind, but we're not creating anything extra on top of it that comes from creating a sense of ownership and self around it. And the sense of the factor of samadhi that we talk about in the Noble Eightfold Path, we can investigate it in terms of meditation and experiences in states of concentration, states of mind. That's one aspect. But another aspect is coming back to this definition of concentration as being centered, being with the center. Concentration is really cum centrum, with the center. So it's about coming back to the center here and being able to stay with that. Coming back to a perspective of looking at things in terms of Dhamma rather than in terms of self. Coming back to a perspective of Dhamma and then learning to stay with that. That's samadhi as well. One very inspiring example of samadhi in that sense of how it manifests is looking at Lombo Somedo's teachings over 50 years of teaching, how he absolutely relentlessly comes back to the Four Noble Truths. In all his teachings, he's always coming back to that point and reflecting from that point. Any questions people can ask, whether it's actually about the Four Noble Truths, whether it's about devas and being from hell realms, future lives, past lives, psychic powers, ghosts, you name it. Whatever people ask, Lumpo always boils it back down to the Four Noble Truths. What is it here and now? Not in terms of self, but in terms of Dhamma. That's samadhi as well. That's concentration. It's that ability to come back to the center and just stay there and work from there, operate from there, investigate from there, study from there. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. I've said enough on these factors of the path, and I'd like to give people opportunities to ask questions if they have any.